Okay, today we're going to have, this is the last topic of the course. It is, as I said before, it's probably the most difficult topic. It's the topic that students tend to have the most difficulty with. You recall earlier in the term I talked about the efficient markets hypothesis and how Eugene Fama just got the Nobel Prize for economics for that theory. All the concepts we're going to talk about today, Merton Miller and Franco Modigliani also got a Nobel Prize for this work. So everything you're studying today is literally Nobel Prize work. And that's why it's a little complicated at times and a little hard to follow. But nevertheless, it's an important area for management because managers, again, starting off with my principle of what will you see in the real world, what will you not see in the real world. You will not see managers in the real world calculating M&M models, so the value of equity and debt using M&M. But you will see managers sitting around a table and worrying about the consequences of changes to their capital structure. And when I say worrying about, I mean considering all the ramifications. How will the debt markets receive it? How will the community receive it? What will happen to our debt rating? What will happen to our financial risk? Does this jeopardize our ability to repay the debt in the future? So capital structure decisions are very important, but there are not a lot of methods around that we use to make the decision of what capital structure we're going to go with. We see very definite variations. Large hospitals, large health systems have got a lot more debt than small hospitals and small health systems, which don't have as much debt. You can just see that. Now, why? I mean, why are large systems at 40, 50% debt and small systems at 20, 30% debt? You know, where did those numbers come from? Were they somebody solve an algorithm? No. It's just what the management of those organizations have decided they can handle. So there's no algorithm, there's no science behind setting what these things are. All I can tell you is it's important and we don't know how to do it. That's really the sum of today's class. We can all go home. So, capital, as we've talked about until now, is the lifeblood of an organization. It's what we use to acquire assets. And capital structure is the mix of debt and equity. So what we're really talking about in the capital structure decision is how much debt can we afford to manage in our capital structure. So we're really talking about how much debt. So just to look at the impact of debt, because it has, the reason it's important is because it has a very distinct impact on risk and return of the organization. So we've got a new walk-in clinic here that needs $200,000 in assets, and it's going to produce $150,000 revenue. And there's only two capital structure alternatives it's considering: all equity and then a 50-50% mix of debt and equity. So the asset side of the balance sheet, and they're both capital structures, are identical because the asset side is not affected by the financing mix. But the liability side is different. So on the left-hand side, we have $0 of debt and $200,000 of equity. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a half and half, $100,000 of each. So let's look at the projected income statements under both these scenarios. Again, right up into the operating income, the first three lines, they are identical. But under the stock debt mix capital structure, there's going to be interest expense of $10,000, which is tax deductible. So the taxable income of both organizations is now very different because this all equity firm has no deductible interest expense, and the capital structure with debt in the structure has $10,000. So we pay taxes at 40%. So you can see that, in fact, that the firm that has the debt in the capital structure pays less taxes because the interest expense is shielded from the tax man. There's a tax shield from having the debt. So the net income is actually the result of the 50 minus the 20 and the 40 minus 16. So you look at that and you see, well, the net income is higher under the stock and it's lower under the stock debt. In other words, having the debt in the capital structure lowers the net income. So what would you consider, what would you say to that? What would that suggest about debt? Just looking at this line here.
Well, if you don't consider the investment, it says that it's better not to have that, just considering those two lines.
Exactly. So if you just go down to this line here, it looks like, well, debt doesn't look that attractive because we actually have lower net income using debt. But why is that not the full story?
I think because you're in one, the stock and debt, you're only using half of your asset. You're only using 50% versus the other, the stock, you used all of it.
Okay, Rochelle, do you want to add to that?
It's not the whole story because what you are looking for is actually you have to report back to your stockholders. Those are the real owners. And actually for the amount of stock that the return on their investment when you have a portion divided between stock and debt is higher.
Exactly. So those are two very good explanations. So here, all equity firm, the owners of the firm are putting up all of the equity, all the capital necessary, $200,000. But here, they're only putting up $100,000 of it, and they're borrowing the other $100,000. So the earnings that are generated, in fact, are, yes, they're still somewhat lower, but in fact, there's a higher return on equity. So for only $200,000, the equity holders are getting a 15% return, but by borrowing $100,000, they're actually getting a 24% return. What is that called? Going from here to here, what are you doing?
Leverage.
It's called leverage. That is the meaning of leverage, right there. Debt is leverage. And why it's leverage is it is a way of levering the return on equity. By adding debt to the capital structure, you're leveraging the ability to earn a higher return on equity. So debt finances lowers the net income, but it actually increases the ROE to equity holders.
Can you say that again?
Although the use of debt financing lowers net income, you can see here, goes from here to here, it lowers net income, but it increases the return on equity. Because $24,000 over $100,000, $24,000 over $100,000 is a higher rate of return than $30,000 over $200,000. So by adding debt to the capital structure, you are leveraging return on equity. You're increasing your return on equity by the presence of debt in the capital structure because you're not having to come up with as much of the equity on your own. You're borrowing it, and you're still getting all the return. So, to understand the impact of capital structure, first we have to differentiate between what we mean by risk, business risk and the financial risk. So business risk, because that capital structure, when you look at the real world, capital structure varies by business risk. Organizations with different types of business risk have got different capital structures. And again, business risk is just the inherent uncertainty and the operating conditions of the industry that it's in. So this assumes that there is this, when we talk about business risk, we're talking about, we are assuming there is no debt. We're just looking at the risk from the business itself without the presence of debt. So when you're looking at business variability in earnings, revenue, without looking at debt, there are several things that affect the basic business risk or the basic risk of any kind of industry. Demand volume variability. What does that mean?
Changes in the economy that affect demand of the service you're providing.
So what would be an example of a healthcare service that's got highly variable demand? particularly like cosmetic surgery. Facelift is something that's not medically necessary, you can put it off. It doesn't really, it will be highly sensitive to changes in person length. As we talked about a few weeks ago, funeral homes, very solid business model. Not much volume variability. Sales price variability. What's an example of a healthcare organization that would have almost no sales price variability?
Meaning that the prices stay consistent over time?
They're the same. They don't go up and down from month to month, week to week, year to year, that much. When you look at all the payers of a healthcare organization, which payer never budgets? Medicare, Medicaid. So if your payer mix has got a high proportion of Medicare and Medicaid patients, you're not going to have as much business risk as if you've got a large portion of your population being self-pay, or even some in a highly competitive commercial market. Input cost variability, what does that mean?
The cost of the things to provide
Sorry?
the cost of the things that you have to use to provide the service or product.
Right, so the cost of of providing healthcare services. So can anyone think of an example where there might be a lot of variability in input costs? Yes.
Pharmaceuticals?
Okay, tell me more about that.
There's constantly new drugs being developed that could have a high variability in cost.
Exactly. So cancer care, for example, is one example of that, where there'll be new types of cancer drugs come out that will replace old ones. There'll be big changes and swings in prices. Healthcare organizations that are located in markets with heavily unionized labor forces, you can see a lot more variation. The ability to change to changing market conditions essentially is all the things that are above, which is how fast can management respond to those kinds of changes. A liability exposure, what does that mean? What kinds of health services have got a lot of liability exposure?
High risk.
High-risk surgery, like neurosurgery. In Miami, I think the average neurosurgeon is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in malpractice insurance. OBGYN in some areas. Again, if you face that kind of uncertainty, you're going to have much more business risk. And then operating leverage. What's operating leverage?
Fixed costs.
Proportion of your costs that are fixed costs. So with a lot of operating leverage being more risky or less risky?
More risk.
A higher degree of operating leverage, the more the business risk, because you can't, you've got sticky costs. You can't just adjust your costs up and down with your revenues. So that introduces more business risk. So there's the basic business risk of the organization itself. Now we've got an organization with all this business risk that it faces, and we're going to introduce financial risk. So not only do they have the risk of the market in which they're operating, now we're going to introduce financial risk, which comes from the fact that debt financing is used. And as soon as you introduce debt financing, the greater the financial risk that the organization will face as well. So what capital structure theory tries to do is to define the relationship between leverage and the business's value. To try and find the best range of the level of debt for that particular organization at that particular period of time, because capital structures will change over time, even within the same organization. So the most widely accepted theory is the trade-off theory, which basically says there are tax-related benefits to debt financing, and that's both for-profit and not-for-profit, because tax-exempt debt has tax benefits. But there are also costs, and these are primarily financial distress. And Mark Holmes and I are doing a lot of work right now with financial distress. of rural hospitals, and it's a huge problem. We're going to see, there are predictions out there now that there's going to be 100 to 300 hospitals closed in the next 2 to 3 years. You see all kinds of hospitals moving into bankruptcy. And the data, the analysis we've done so far show that, excuse me, one of the main differentiators between hospitals that get into financial distress and the ones that don't is the amount of debt they have in their capital structure.